Good morning, everybody. Hugo Martinez here with Buen Pastor and Monday Morning Pastor. Thank you for tuning in this week. We have a couple of things that I want to get into. No guests today, but it's just going to be me sharing a few things. For example, we're going to talk a little bit about this podcast and what kind of work has been going into it. Also, we're going to be talking about church discipline, so I know that's going to be an interesting topic. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is following up and following through with first-time visitors and maybe even some church members who don't assist as consistently. So stay tuned to hear a little bit more about all that. All right, guys, so like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about this podcast. One of the things that we're noticing is there's going to be a lot of work that's going to go into this. We've been kind of changing up our setup, changing up the cameras that we're using, the systems, and all the different technology that goes into it. And so I wanted to share a little bit about that because maybe that's something that you're looking to start as a podcast. And so I wanted to tell you some of the things that we've learned. It takes a lot of work, but one of the main things is that it takes a lot of time. And so we're noticing that when we record only once per week, we can tend to get a little bit behind with all the editing. And so what we're trying to do is record multiple times before we start posting more. And so if that's something that you're interested in, is creating a podcast, posting it online, and you want to do it weekly, I would highly encourage you to record several episodes before you ever go public. That's something that if I could go back, I would have done a little bit more of. I know you're excited. I know you want to get the content out there. That's what I was dealing with. But if you can even just put it off by about a month or two, record about 6 episodes. I know that sounds like a lot. We did 2 before we ever launched, but 6 episodes is probably a good buffer so you can continue to record throughout those 6 weeks so that the next time you post, you're way ahead. So just wanted to share that because it's something that we've learned and maybe you've been keeping up with this and something that you're interested in starting. So I wanted to give you a little bit of insight on that. All right, the second thing that I want to talk to you about is church discipline. I know that this is not an easy topic, and so I'm going to share a few verses. I'm going to share a little bit of insight and give you a few examples of how to handle this. Now, this is not coming from me. I'm not an expert in this. I've been in ministry for a little bit over 10 years and just pastoring as far as the entire church for a little bit close to a year, and so I don't pretend to be an expert. These are things that we find in Scripture. These are things that I've come to find out through experiences, but really through speaking to other pastors and how they've handled these situations. And so church discipline can be a good thing. I know that sounds crazy, but every time that there is conflict, there is a chance for growth. There's a chance to even come closer together as a church family. And so before we get into any of the how to handle this, I want you to know that if you're dealing with church discipline, if you're dealing with any kind of conflict, take that as a sign that God is uncovering things that need to be changed, that need to be maybe cleaned up a little bit so that He gets the glory, but ultimately the health of the church is better because of it. And if you handle it God's way, you can be rest assured that that's what's going to happen. So really, I want to start there with the scripture. I'm going to take you to Matthew chapter 18. It starts in verse 15, and this is Jesus. He's saying this to his disciples. He says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained a brother." So there's actually 3 steps. This is actually step number 1. So when there is conflict, you have to understand who are the people that are involved. That's 1. And where did this take place? I know it doesn't sound like a very important detail, but if you know where and who's involved, you're going to know how to approach this situation. And I'll get into more of that here in a second. But once you have those details, you really want to make sure that the 2 people that are involved are the main ones talking in this first step. When something happens, you want to encourage the person that is dealing with the situation to go directly to the brother or to the sister that maybe offended them, that maybe even caused them some harm, and speak directly to them one-on-one. Nobody else around. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is where a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunications can occur. You might even get into he said or she said, and nobody really knows what happened because this was a meeting between just two people. So one thing that you can do is you can write some things down, and you can ask the other person and say, is this what you mean? I want to write it down because I don't want to forget what we've come to an agreement on. Now, if it begins to get out of control, maybe the emotions are a little bit high, I would highly encourage you to just stop the meeting there. If you realize that it's not being productive, and say, you know what, I don't think that this is going anywhere. I don't think that we're making progress. Why don't we stop the conversation now and we can come back to revisit it? That might be a good indication that it's time to move on to step number 2, which we're going to look at here in a second. But before we do that, I want to continue with step number 1. It's really important that when you're talking to the person that you're making sure that you're attacking the situation. You're not attacking the person. I know you've probably heard that before, but what that looks like is what happened. Don't focus on who was the aggressor, who did this, and who did that, but what actually happened, and see if maybe there's something in there that was misunderstood, and if you can fix it. Even the person's words is a place of emphasis. For example, if somebody says something that offends you, you can attack that situation by saying, when you said this, this is how it made me feel. Don't go after the person and start saying, well, you always do this and you always do that. That's not going to be beneficial. Go to the issue at hand. Try not to bring up things from the past until you've resolved the issue at hand. Once you resolve that and you have more time, maybe you're a little bit more calm and you want to continue meeting with that person, I think that's great. But if you're going to that person one-on-one, attack the issue, not the person, and stay on topic. Don't bring a bunch of other things from the past. Resolve the issue, and then if you would like to go back to touch on other things that are happening either before or that have to do with it, then that would be a great time. Now, and that's not to say that this will be the end-all be-all. That's not to say that the problem will be resolved, and the Bible knows that. But if it is, guess what? The Bible gives us some clear celebrations here, because it says, if he listens to you, you have gained a brother. I have seen so many great relationships start with conflict, believe it or not. When two people were getting into it, they had some situation between them. After they were able to resolve the conflict, they were like best friends. They knew what it was like to be in the trenches, to have those strong emotions. And now that they have been able to compromise or come to an agreement, they seem to really get along. And sometimes that can happen, not always, but the Bible gives us that is a possibility, that you can gain a brother and a friend that you will be able to get along with moving forward. So there's some good news there. But again, if that doesn't resolve the issue, there's step number 2. So let's keep reading. It says, but if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Okay, here's where you get others involved. And this is why I said it's important to know who's involved and where it happened. Ministry leaders, this is where you have to step in. If there's a situation that's going on in your particular ministry, it is your job to be that witness. Not always the pastor. I know we'd like to get the pastor involved. We're seeking his wise counsel and his wisdom, and that's great. But he doesn't necessarily need to be one of those witnesses, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, if your church is 200 or more members, it's going to be really hard for the pastor to make time to be there. But second, and probably more important, you being the ministry leader, that is your space of authority, and you probably know more than even your pastor does when it comes to those people that you're ministering to and in your space, in your ministry. And so you want to be that person. You also want to make sure that you stay unbiased to who is calling you to be a witness. Not already choosing sides, but coming in to listen, to clearly understand what each person is saying. And really, it's just to be accountable that if something were to happen from that moment moving forward, that you would be able to say, yes, that's what was said, or no, that's not what happened. That's not what the person said. That's why you're there, to witness. Now, if they ask you for your opinion, if they ask you to kind of weigh in, again, try your best to stay neutral, but at the same time, if something is wrong, it is wrong. But if somebody is right, don't focus on telling the person that they are right, but maybe focus more on saying, here is the right thing to do, here was the right thing to say, here was the wrong thing to do, here's the wrong thing to say. Do not Try not to choose sides that will push the other person away, and they might not be willing to listen to you, especially if they feel like you are taking somebody's side. So I just wanted to share that because that is important. There's other methods of resolving conflict, making sure you establish rules for who talks and how long and how they talk. For example, not focusing on what the other person did, but maybe focusing more on what I did and what I could change, because ultimately we can only control ourselves, right? So as that second step, make sure you bring a witness. Now we've elevated the situation. More people are starting to get involved, but typically this is where the problem is resolved. At least in our church, we've seen this been very helpful. We have the process set up, and this is where we go step by step. And by this step, when somebody else is involved, typically there's a compromise, there's a resolution, and we can continue moving forward as a healthy church. But that doesn't always happen, and then there's other ways to handle this. I would highly encourage you to stay in step one for a little bit longer, meaning do a few more meetings with the same witnesses as you begin to uncover what the situation was and what was going on. But if that does not resolve the issue, there is another step. So let's keep reading what it says. We're in verse 17. It says, if he refuses to listen to them, the witnesses, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. This is really tough as a pastor to have to go to your congregation and let them know that something is going on, that there's some conflict that's happening. But I want to share a little bit about how I would do this. I haven't had to get to this point, and we've been very blessed in that, and I believe it's because we've taken the time to do steps 1 and 2 thoroughly. But if we ever got to this point, I want you to know that this could be on a Sunday morning where you share this with the congregation, and there might be some visitors there who are going to listen and hear what's going on. But you can do this in a healthy way. One thing I would say is do not mention the people by name, and here's why. We're trying not to embarrass them. We're trying not to shame them. But we do want to call out the action that has taken place. And you can do that without saying the names. Here's another thing. When they begin to hear, meaning your members at your church begin to hear what's happening and the conflict that's going on, because we know that word is going to get around, once you've addressed the issue, they have a lot more context and they know your point of view. But if they've not heard about the situation, if they've not heard about the conflict, then you're not giving them too much information so that then now they see those members in a different light. But as soon as they do hear about it, now they can take what you said and understand what really happened. I want to give you a real life, real situation that could occur so you can kind of put this into context. So, taking, for example, let's just go with the women's ministry. If two sisters have gotten into some kind of argument, if there's been some kind of offense, the first step, again, is to encourage those two ladies to come together in a one-on-one meeting and speak about what's going on, reminding them to be cordial and polite in their conversations, and even writing some things down to make sure that they're on the same page. If the meeting begins to get out of hand and it doesn't seem to be productive, that would be a great opportunity to say, let's move on to step number 2. Step number 2, bring some witnesses. Remember, ministry leaders, this is where you come in. If this happened with your ministry, with your particular group that you minister to in your space, this is where you have to step up. Now, again, if this is a church-wide issue, if this happened on a Sunday morning, potentially the witness would be the pastor. But before that, we want to get the ministry leaders in there because they're going to be able to have more information. They know these people a little bit better, depending on your church size. So, step number 2, the sister, she brings the ministry leader, the women's ministry leader, into the conversation. She comes as an unbiased witness to listen, to hear, and to be able to testify if something was misconstrued or somebody just doesn't remember the information correctly. If they ask for your opinion, remember, try to stay unbiased. Attacking the situation and not the person is going to be your best bet. All right. Now, again, if this doesn't resolve the issue, which I think it might, I think by this point, there's a good chance that you're already coming to a resolution. But if it doesn't, this is where the pastor would really need to step in. And in this particular situation, if the pastor has to mention this to the church, don't mention the person's name. Simply state what is going on and how you view it as a church and how you're going to move forward. For example, if the offense was a sister was being rude to another one, or maybe even potentially put her hands on the other person, you could address it by saying, brothers and sisters, there has been a situation at our church, and we just want to remind everybody that we are going to be polite to each other, that if there is a disagreement, that we don't need to say choice words to each other, and we definitely don't want to be violent or physically assaulting our members, and so we're not going to allow that. That is unacceptable, and it cannot continue. That is where, if somebody from your church is not aware of the situation, they're not going to know who you're talking about. But if they are aware of the situation, they're going to understand who you're talking about and the church's position on this stance. Now, here's what could happen, and we have to be okay with this. The Bible tells us to treat them as a Gentile or as a tax collector. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things in those times when we talk about Gentiles and tax collectors. These weren't people that necessarily were conforming to the way that the church was being built at that time. And so these are people that were considered somewhat of an outcast. Now, we always love on these people and we always treat them with respect, but are we going to give them a ministry position? Are we going to put them into leadership? We wouldn't do that with the Gentile or a tax collector if they are unbelieving. And that's how we treat these brothers and sisters in Christ. We give them time to meditate on the word, for God to begin to work in their hearts so that they can change and see their faults and continue to grow spiritually before bringing them back into a leadership position or serving. We want to make sure we give them that time, because their heart is really what matters. Here's what typically happens is that those members that have gone through those 3 steps and have not repented or turned away or acknowledged that what they did was wrong, they tend to leave the church. And that's a really sad thing for us to see and to hear about. But pastors, I want you to be encouraged that if you're doing it the biblical way and somebody chooses to leave your church, you do not have anything to be ashamed about. You have peace knowing that you followed God's way of handling church conflict, church discipline. And if this person has chosen to leave, continue to pray for them, continue to be open to their return and their asking for forgiveness. But that doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. These things happen, and if you handle it in a biblical way, you can be rest assured that God will take care of it. And so remember, that's Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 18, if I'm not mistaken. I would encourage you to look it up, study that word, and put it into practice. This is how we handle church conflict, church discipline here at our church. We've seen it been very helpful, and I hope it helps you out. Like I said, I'm not an expert. These are things that I've learned along the way from other pastors who have been in ministry for a long time. But if you have any questions, please reach out. I'd love to be able to connect with you and possibly walk you through some of the church conflict or church discipline processes that we have in place.